Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I'm joined by Andrew Stratelates, Henry, and Master Sanders to discuss the Lex Talionis within the context of Matthew 5:38-42. So the case that I'm going to lay out is thus. In Matthew 5, we see the five antitheses, where Christ is saying, okay, you've heard this way, and then now it's this way. Now, in all but one of the antitheses, these can be derived from the law of Moses. You should not commit murder, you should not commit adultery, you should not make false vows, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Now, the fifth antithesis may not be found explicitly in the law of Moses, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but one could theoretically derive the command to hate one's enemy from Psalm 139, where David says, I hate your enemies with a perfect hatred. So we see it with the possible exception of the fifth antitheses. All of these antitheses are Christ looking at something that they have received through Moses and then saying, well, I've got something different in mind. This is going to be a different setup under my new rules. Now, if we look at the first instance of Matthew 5:38, we see that Christ is opening with a citation from Exodus, can be found in three places: Exodus 21:24, Leviticus 24:20, and Deuteronomy 19:21. Now, what's important here is that these are, of course, wronged parties in a judicial case. We see that in the broader context that the Jewish and rabbinical commentaries and theological development on the sort of strict maiming of a person was gradually being watered down. An extensive study on the rabbinical changes can be found in Lex Talionis in Early Judaism and the Exhortation of Jesus in Matthew 5:38-42 by James E. Davis. So what we see is that the rabbis, and this culminates in Maimonides in the Middle Ages, who says, the idea of chopping someone's finger off and plucking their eye out is kind of so absurd. Can you blame us for going to financial transactions to have wrong parties satisfied? So we already see that there's this sort of watering down of the sort of maiming quality of the Lex Talionis. Now, it should be kept in mind as well that the Lex Talionis, though in common usage often is understood to mean a kind of revenge, a cycle of revenge. Think of the Hatfields and the McCoys. Far from it. What we see in the Torah is that God is setting a limit upon which violence can be perpetrated beyond a certain point. And so the Lex Talionis in the Mosaic context is already a quote, limiting factor on violence by essentially entrusting it to legitimate authorities through prescribed forms and measures. And so now we see, if we keep that in mind, we go on to verse 38, where Jesus says, let me look this up real quick. Verse 39. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. Now, the word evil person is pronopos. Now, in the Greek, in both the LXX and the New Testament, pronopos can either mean Lucifer, evil in general, or it can mean the evil person, an evil individual that's actively trying to harm you. Now, in what sense is pronopos being used in Matthew 5:39? Well, it's clearly not being used to refer to resisting Satan, because in James 4:7 and 1 Peter 5:9, we're told that we should resist Satan. So in that sense, the evil one is not Satan. Evil in general, it's unlikely that it means evil in general, because there are numerous injunctions to resist the evil in general. For example, Mark 7:23. Now, as a negative argument through the law of exclusion, we then find that it's the evil person. Now, the other thing that we see is that in each case, when Christ changes or modifies slightly what we see in these antitheses, he then further explains what he means. So, for example, in the first antitheses, you should not commit murder. We then learn that hating your brother makes you worthy of hellfire, calling him fool, which is certainly not what Moses said. So Christ is saying it's an even higher penalty. The bar is being raised. But it's an explanation to what his antithesis is. And so if we look at the explanation we get in Matthew 5, 40 to 42, Matthew 5, 40 to 42, we see three cases. One who wants to take your shirt by suit, so you give him your undergarment as well, which will leave you in the nude. Number 41, whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2. So if you're conscripted for corps of labor. And then 42, give to him who asks and do not turn away him who wants to borrow from you. Now there's reason to believe from the similar comment made in the Sermon on the Plain, Luke 6:27 to 36, in the New Interpreter's Bible, Volume 9, that the giving to someone is probably someone in a higher position trying to take advantage of you. So like an occupying force or a nobleman or a rich person who's taking advantage of you. So like, give me your horse, I want it because, I can take it from you. And that would seem to gel well with 41 because it's a soldier forcing you to go an extra mile. Or it also gels with 40 because it's dealing with somebody who's trying to force you to give up your cloak in a lawsuit. So, and none of these three cases is the evil one mentioned an impersonal force or the devil. So the positive and negative argument indicates that the evil one is a person, not the devil, and not some abstract force. Now, furthermore, in the first two antitheses, revolving around murder and lust, most Christians take the radical extent of the antitheses seriously. So, growing up my entire life, I was told, don't hate your brother. You'll be worthy of hellfire. Not just my parents, but the broader Christian community in which I grew up. The same would go for the second antitheses in verse 27. You should not commit adultery. And they'll say, yeah, but Jesus raises the bar even higher because lusting after a woman is adultery. So be really on guard here. Like that little children's song, "Be careful, little eyes, what you see." But all of a sudden, we get to the next three antitheses, of which we're only going to be dealing with the fourth today. And all of a sudden, they're like, nah, he doesn't really mean that radical stuff. That's not the case. Now, what's key here, though, is if in the first two antitheses, Christians generally take their more radical take on it, the conjunct that's used is just like your normal and or but. It's not. It indicates a change, but not a radical change. What we find in Matthew 5:39, the word "but" is the Greek word "Allah," alpha, lambda, lambda, alpha, which describes, it's an exclamation point upon an exclamation point. It's not just a conjunct, but like an exclamation conjunct. So if the buts and the ands in the first two antitheses are understood to be a subversion or extension or change of what came before, an exclamation point upon an exclamation point makes it even harder to take that in a context other than which it could be taken at face value. And so the case that I'm arguing is there's really no good reason to take the last three antitheses in any less of a radical sense of the meaning than the first two antitheses, and least of all the fourth, because of the exclamation point upon the exclamation point of Allah. Second of all, prosopon, the evil one, is highly unlikely to be the devil because of what we read in James and First Peter, and it's unlikely to be evil in general because of Mark 7:23, which then leaves us with the evil person. Furthermore, as Christ explains the context in which we are to not resist the evil person, there's a clear assumption of power imbalance, with the Christian having the imbalance of that issue. Someone is suing you, doing you wrong. And as we saw in 1 Corinthians 6, Paul says you do one another wrong to sue one another. You better be defrauded than sue someone else. So the one who initiates the lawsuit is the one wronging you. So we can tie verse 40 to what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6. It's 41 is self-evident. Somebody who conscripts you to do forced labor is obviously the tyrant, whether he's an occupying force or your own standing private army. And then 42, I think there's good reasons to believe it. That can also be put into that context. In the way, for example, like when Pilate demanded elements of the treasury of the Jewish temple prior to the story of Christ and his passion. It's that kind of taking that's implied here. So this is assumed All right, can you hear me? Yeah, it's back now. Okay, so what did I cut out from? How much did I lose?
You said there's an assumption.
When was that?
About 2 minutes ago.
No, the assumption about what?
Let's see. You talked about the conjunctive and the contrastive form of Allah there, and
That was it. That's where I cut out.
a little bit after that. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll pick up from there. We see there that we have a double exclamation point, as it were. Allah is a exclamation point upon an exclamation point. So from the first two antitheses, the general conjunct indicates a change. And most Protestants, and I think even most Catholics and Orthodox would agree that we should take those in the more radical senses, that looking after a woman with lust is in some sense spiritually equivalent to adultery, and that hating your brother is in some sense spiritually equivalent to murder. Now, if we're going to take it in the radical sense in the first two antitheses for a less serious conjunct, and a conjunct that is an order higher, it's even less plausible that would be the case. That you could say, well, no, that's not to be taken in its most literal, serious context. And when we look at the sense in which we talk about the evil person, whether it be Satan, whether it be evil in general, or whether it be the evil person, we see that it's unlikely to be the evil. It's unlikely to be Satan, because in James 4:7 and 1 Peter 5:9, we're told to resist the devil and he will flee. It's unlikely to be evil in general, because numerous injunctions, of which one includes Mark 7:23, we should resist evil in general. So that leaves us with the evil person. And I think the best indication then is that the evil person is what we're left with. One, by process of elimination, since there's no other command to resist the evil person in that sense, but also from a positive argument, in that when Christ has an antithesis, he then explains what he means by it in the succeeding verses. And when we look at how Christ explains these antitheses, we see in verse 40, we're talking about a man in a lawsuit. Verse 41, we're talking about a soldier, presumably, that makes you go 1 mile, and you go 2 with them. And then 42, a man who wants you to take something from you, and you should not turn him away. Now, there is some indication, according to the NIB, the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary, Volume 9 on Luke, that in the Sermon on the Plain, where they deal with a similar topic, the person who you're not supposed to turn away, who asks from you, is someone in a authority position. So if some authority figure says, I want to take your crops, your livestock, or something more like that. So we see this implicit power differential here. So in the subsequent verses, we don't see the devil or evil in general as being the evil one that we're to not resist. And so if we look at that as a sort of, we then have, I guess, the three classic views. There's a sort of Augustinian just war interpretation of this. There's the Niebuhrian realist interpretation of this. And there's what, in more modern times, we have associated with John Howard Yoder, but is also could be considered the classic Anabaptist position of a more literalistic interpretation of this in the extreme sense. And I think from the textual evidence alone, this is the most reasonable way to account for Matthew 5:38 to 42. And furthermore, given the whole flow of the antitheses, and that really there's no debate amongst Christians upon the first two antitheses in the radical extent in which you take the passage, there seems to be no good reason from the text itself to argue that the last three antitheses, of which the fourth one we're concerned with today, is to be not taken in the same literal extensive sense the first two are, especially since the conjunct Allah in verse 39 is a more serious, more weighty conjunct than in the first two antitheses. So there you go, Andrew. You can have the ball now.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to start off with the things that I agree with. First of all, I agree and believe you are correct that interpreting this as an evil person who's maybe an abstract one or a stand-in rather than evil in general is obviously correct. There's biblical and natural theology backing that up. And I also agree with you that this needs to be interpreted in the same way that we interpret the other parts of Matthew, and that one can't lax this one or interpret it differently than the ones about murder and adultery and so on and so forth. So all of that are things that we're in total agreement on. And I also agree that this constrains our actions as Christians even more than the Mosaic Law did. And the way that I would put it is the Mosaic Law, in some sense, outlines where Christian perfection is, but the boundaries of Mosaic Law are far off from being a saint or to be as Christ was. And or to put it another way, if you are outside the Mosaic Law, you are definitely wrong. So the Capone way of, he beats up one of my guys, I put one of his in the morgue, is obviously and totally wrong. Both under the Mosaic understanding and all Christian understandings. So basically, the issue of difference in interpretation comes down to the exact details of the examples used. And we'll start with the adultery one for an example, right? So lust is a combination of a couple things, right? It's sexual attraction, then it is the appearance of the thought that it would be good to have sex with this person that I'm not lawfully allowed to, right? And, to use an example, I find Scarlett Johansson extremely attractive, and occasionally have daydreams about her repenting of her ways and becoming a devout Anglican and getting married and being happily ever after. That daydream, although weird, is not necessarily committing adultery, right? To commit adultery in the heart, I would have to have the thought, oh gosh, it would be great to have unlawful sex with Scarlett Johansson, and then I would have to assent and affirm that in my heart, which is more than the automatic thought, right? And a similar type of thing is going on here, I think, that there is an excessive way to interpret it or a more narrow way, and I think the more narrow way is correct. And I'll go into detail with the examples that Christ uses. The first one is, whoever strikes you on the right cheek, turn him to the other also. And basically, the two things point out to me in this. One is Christ doesn't say, if someone strikes you on the cheek, continue to let him strike you on that cheek, right? Which is the sort of extremely radical pacifist view, which may or may not be what you're advocating. The more limited, I think this actually gives a limit on how much you are allowed to submit, because you're saying you can strike me, but you have to strike a fresh area as well. Another interesting thing to keep in note is, if someone's striking you under Jewish law, for each time they strike you, the fine is increased. So based on the commentaries I've read, the first strike was like 1 shekel. So in this, it's actually a radical stance of faith to God, especially, but also to the rightly appointed authorities, that by giving your adversary the opportunity to make their punishment greater, God will recompense in the end. And I think that this is a key part, is that, and I somewhat agree with you on the last one, that it says, if someone asks something of you, don't turn them away. And this is an expansion of the laws of borrowing for Israelites, right? That you were obligated under Mosaic law, culturally and legally, to loan things for no interest. But the other things, I think, sort of show a little more subtlety than just necessarily full passivity, because by engaging in like turning your cheek, you're giving them the opportunity to increase their punishment. By giving your cloak as well as your coat, there's actually a law in Exodus that says that you have to give back someone's coat because by sunset, because that's how you basically sleep at night. And so basically what you're doing is you're inviting your opponent to fill their cup of sin full, in some sense. And similarly, then this doesn't have as much biblical support, but I've read some explanations that with walking 2 miles, let's say that it's an occupying force of Romans or Persians, right? Romans might be jerks, but they follow the law, their law and order. And so if a soldier asks a Jew to carry their pack for a mile, that's what's allowed under Roman law. But if the Jew goes and does it another mile, they're now switching the position, so that the Roman in some sense has to rely on the testimony of the Jew that he's not abusing him, and that, no, I voluntarily walked 2 miles. And I think that this might be the fundamental disagreement we have, is how does the use of lawful authority and punishment come into these things? Because there's a very different question of whether I should turn the other cheek versus, let's say, a child is being attacked by an adversary, and whether I can intervene. And this is, I think, in accord with sort of the just law understanding that there are definitely radical limits on what a Christian can do compared to even a Jew or a pagan when it comes to using violence or force, or even things that are analogous to that, like civil courts. But I don't think it is necessarily the radical pacifist or Mennonite position.
Okay, before we move on to Henry, I want to ask you 2 questions, Andrew, for clarification, or maybe actually 3. One, I think you would agree, right, that in the antitheses, Christ is asking us to do more than the law requires. You mentioned precisely the example of the cloak. Giving them the undergarment would be more than the law requires. Also, sort of the honor, sort of honor code humiliation, forcing them to slap you on the other cheek, or subverting, going with them 2 miles. That's like Paul on Acts 16. Oh, you put me in prison without a trial and beat me as a Roman citizen? You come and get me. I'm not going to make it easy for you. So, and then also, well, those are the 2 questions. So would you agree that, one, the antitheses demand more than the law initially required, and that Paul is sort of engaging in that kind of subversive resistance?
Yes, I would, and I think those are both the appropriate action for the typical Christian layman. The question sort of comes in: what are your duties as like a Christian soldier or a Christian magistrate or Christian police officer, where you have legitimate authority to wield the sword? And that I think is the point where this requires additional context and an understanding to apply correctly.
Okay, good. One thing that I forgot to do, which would have been better to start with, is Henry and I are going to take the strict pacifist position that you'd find with John Howard Yoder, Hauerwas in contemporary times, but also the more classic Anabaptist perspective from like Michael Statler's The Slide-Time Confession or Menno Simons. Andrew is representing the more classic just war position, and at his current point in his theological life, Master Sanders is searching. So I think that's probably, so for the viewer, so you know who you're dealing with and what our positions are, I should have started out with that. But yeah, go ahead, Henry. What are some of your thoughts on the exegesis here, the pros and the cons of both sides here?
Yeah. So as you already know, I'm convinced that the Anabaptist, the traditional perspective, is the perfect perspective of what the five antitheses clearly speak. Um, Now, I want to say that the first three antitheses, I think those have been the most well observed for the last 2,000 so years uh, by Catholics, Protestants, even in the medieval age. Uh, the Western Church, especially, took very literally the whole idea of divorce. Yeah, this dogma of what you put together, put not asunder. That is something I would say that the traditional church has always understood. But when it comes to the last two, on the issue of oaths and retaliation, and whether or not that's for, we're take that 100% literally, I would say those two antitheses have been the most neglected by the church. And I think that's when the Anabaptists come in to better understand the perspective of the literal exegesis of the Sermon on the Mount. Um, that's why, yeah, with Michael Sattler in the Schleitheim Confession, um, after you have the Luther's Reformation, Calvin's, and um, these guys, they sort of understood the Sermon on the Mount and everything, but it wasn't until Michael Sattler and the early Anabaptists resurrected, if you will, the exegesis of the clear meaning of the Sermon on the Mount. Uh, uh, so basically, Menno Simmons and Michael Sattler, they were saying, hey, we need to get back to not just three of the antitheses, we need to get back to all five of them. The church does too many oaths, they're doing too much wars, and we're not told to defend ourselves. And all the reason for that was from the literal interpretation of Matthew 5, 33 to 42. That's why in the Schleitheim Confession, Michael Sattler, when he wrote the 7 articles, he made a very dogmatic all the 5 antitheses in Matthew 5, especially the issue of oaths and retaliation. That's why in the Schleitheim Confession, Sattler said, um, you shall not do any civil oaths of allegiance or any religious vows of poverty, chastity, etc. All these established vows that the historic church was setting up after Constantine, by the way.
Excuse me, not to interrupt here, but 2 points. I'm getting some comments from the group saying that they can't really hear you. Is there a way that you can make your
Okay.
audio louder or more clear? And also, oaths, while important, are not for today's discussion. Maybe for another topic on the antitheses.
Yeah, I'm just trying to just summarize the other antitheses just for the argument of Lex Talionis. I'm just trying to look at how the Anabaptists that they looked at all the 5, not just the first 3.
Okay.
Okay, so can you hear me now? I can't get any closer to my microphone.
Okay. If that's the best
Yeah.
you can do, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So yeah, Michael Sattler in the Schleitheim Confession. Uh, um, everyone was calling the Schleitheim Confession a very radical confession of faith, if you will, because you have this gap, if you will, for the 4th century to the 16th century. Here you have the Anabaptists coming along, and a lot of things they're saying is very radical, especially on Lex Talionis. in the Solemn Confession, the Anabaptists were saying something that hardly anyone else in the church was saying, that we're to take the pacifistic view, if you will, interpretation of what Jesus says, turn the other cheek, and basically Jesus is saying, like, deny yourself, deny self-defense, and that was a big reason why you had martyrs. I would say that's the perfect definition of martyrdom. If you deny self-defense, I guess you could say spiritually, you're becoming a lamb offered to the slaughter, just as Christ was. And I think it's important to remember that the fifth antithesis, all the apostles were understood perfectly. And, like, they didn't have to ask any questions. And Christ himself took it to the extreme at his crucifixion, on the passion on the cross. He fully imitated what he preached. So he took, if you will, non-resistance to the extreme when it came to when he confronted Pontius Pilate, the Sanhedrin, and he never once defended himself. And that's how the Solemn Confession, all these early Anabaptist theologians, that they also took that same idea of that we're not to defend ourselves or to imitate Christ, because he did it, the fifth antithesis to the cross, if you will. And I'm not sure how else you could interpret that, except the allegorical interpretation, which I think is really speculative and doesn't go with the plain exegesis of Scripture. That's how I'd summarize Lex Talionis.
All right, thanks, Henry. So, Master Sanders, I hear you have some questions for us here.
Yes. I kind of want to go back to something that Andrew alluded to when it came to giving up some of these matters to God. When it comes to seeking justice for wrongs committed, would that be an accurate summation, Andrew?
Yeah, and there's a little bit of an open question of how much of that gets actualized through the magistrate in this life and prior kingdom come. And my feeling, and I don't have a good grounds to explain this, is that is some of the implied intuition in these things. But yeah, that's right. That we're trusting in God to grant the appropriate recompense and to the wrongs to us.
Okay, and that's fair. Okay, and the reason why I sort of bring this up, because when we talk about pacifism, I think that there is a very thin line, or can be a thin line, between pacifism and passivity. Well, we can get into that a little bit later in this discussion, but I want to bring up two particular psalms that seem to allude to a little bit what you're talking about, Andrew, but I kind of want to throw this open to those that tend to be on the pacifistic side too. So here, for example, in Psalm 69, David is telling God about his enemies, verse 22, saying, "Let their table become a snare before them, and their well-being a trap. Let their eyes be darkened, so that they do not see, and that their loins shake continually. Pour out your indignation upon them, and let your wrath fly anger take hold of them. Let their dwelling place be desolate. Let no one live in their tents, for they persecute the ones you have struck. And talk of the grief of those you have wounded, and add iniquity to their iniquity, and let them not come out of your righteousness. Let them be blotted out of the book of the living, and not be written with the righteous." And in Psalm 109, we see a similar one, and this one was brought up by a number of my conservative friends about the time of Obama. Verse 6 saying, "Set a wicked man over my enemy," and that's my edition. "And let an accuser stand at his right hand. When he is judged, let him be found guilty, and let his prayer become sin. Let his days be few, and let another take his office. Let his children be fatherless, and his wife a widow. Let his children continually be vagabonds and beg. Let them seek their bread also from desolate places. Let the creditor seize all that he has. and let strangers plunder his labor. Let there be none to extend mercy to him, nor let there be any to favor his fatherless children. Let his posterity be cut off, and in the generation following, let their name be blotted out. So, and then if we go even further, you can see, I believe it's Psalm 137, where the singer wishes for judgment to come upon the people of Babylon for their children to be dashed against the rocks, right? So we have this theme throughout the Psalms of this idea of God doling out punishment in a sort of Lex Talionis sense, because these things are being done to the writer. These things that are being done to David, David is asking to be done to his enemies, and so, or what was done to Israel, is the singer prays that this will be done to the Israelites, to the Babylonians. Now we know of instances within the Psalms where the psalmist will express that he has a feeling that maybe he's actually feeling, but he has no, that's not rooted in reality. So, for example, in Psalm 73, he said, I saw my enemies basically enjoying everything, and I felt like there was no justice. So, again, there are feelings within Psalms that are expressed that are not necessarily right. But in this case, it could be argued that that David or whatever psalmist is appealing to God's sense of justice, particularly through Lex Talionis. And this is under the jurisdiction, of course, or under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. So, and this would be to all three, but I would like to see what the pacifists would have to say. Based on this assumption of not resisting your enemy, would this naturally extend to the fact that we shouldn't pray for justice when it comes to our enemies, especially in case of truly being wronged in circumstances such as that David, or even worse, have been experienced?
Okay, so I think I'll start with this, and then I'll hand it off to you, Henry, to answer that. What I would argue is a sort of corollary to Matthew 5 is Luke 6, which is the Sermon on the Plain, which begins in verse 27. And I'll just read you the first two verses. But I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. Okay, love your enemies. That's what we see in the fifth antithesis. So, but also Christ is again explaining what does loving your enemy look like. Bless those who curse you and pray for those who spitefully use you. And then it goes on in verse 29 to striking the cheek, the cloak, and the tunic, which has already been covered thusly. So I would argue that Luke 6, 27 and 28 is a further extension of loving your enemy, which is the fifth antithesis. And looking at the fifth antithesis in this regard, we see that you're supposed to pray for your opponent rather than curse them. Because what you're describing is really the imprecatory prayers of justice. And I believe it's in James where James says that mercy supersedes justice. So we're living in the age of mercy. Or for example, like in Luke, where they go to the Samaritan village and the disciples say, "Should we call fire down from heaven?" And Christ is like, "No, you get it all wrong, guys. We're not in that way of thinking anymore. We're here to save the damned, not to damn the damned." And related to your question and to a point that Andrew made and a point that Henry made, I think the strongest indication that all five antitheses should be taken in the most radical sense is that in the life of Christ himself, he lived out all five antitheses in the most radical way. So in the first two antitheses, which none of us disagree about, and even Henry admitted has been kept fairly well by all Christians, we'd all agree that, yeah, Christ lived out those antitheses. And then when we see the other three, the one about hating and resisting with violence, and also cursing. Oh no, that wasn't the fifth antithesis. Cursing is in Luke. The other one. We see that he did all those as well. All oaths. He didn't swear any oaths. And so we also see in a relation to this that you, I think, brought up again, Master Sanders, passivism versus passivity. So when there's an evil situation, okay, an evil person, you could do one of at least three things to that person. You could respond in kind. You could do absolutely nothing, sort of like the Stoic idea of apatheia. You just kind of don't really give it any mind at all. It's just you're sort of abstracted from the event. Or you do what Paul says in Romans 12. You do good to those that hate you, to pour boiling coals on their head. And this is, I think, where the word pacifism is unfortunate in the use that it's used. It's not necessarily one that the Anabaptists themselves used. They had a German term that escapes me, but it meant to go around weaponless. There's a really great video on the YouTube channel, The Bible Project, called The Way of the Exile. And it starts in Jeremiah, where it says, when you go to Babylon, bless Babylon, seek the well-being of Babylon, and have children in Babylon. And we then see in this little clip that they do that the story of Daniel and his 3 friends are an example of living out Jeremiah's injunction. And what we then see is that after that, we have Christ, and he sort of is moving further on that. So it would be more appropriate to see this position as exactly what Jesus and Paul say that it is, responding to evil with good, which in some sense it is easier just to say nothing and just not deal with the evil person at all. But that's not at all what Jesus or Paul are saying, and it would be unfair and unjust and uncharitable to say that the classic Anabaptist Judean position would be recommending that either. So that's how I would answer the question that Master Sanders asked. How would you answer that, Henry?
Yeah, I want to also add that it's important that we understand the context of the Ante-Nicene church and how the early Christians understood the Lex Talionis. We have the church fathers there to assist us. I'm going to share a few quotes here. So, for example, Justin Martyr, he wrote, "We who formerly used to murder one another do not only now refrain from making war upon our enemies, but also that we may not lie nor deceive our examiners, willingly die confessing Christ." So in the early church, we had a lot of martyrs. We don't see it anymore for many reasons. Like I was saying earlier, the perfect definition of martyrs is to deny self-defense. And yeah, I would agree with you, Todd, that I think pacifism is not the correct word. We have to break it down to a better definition. Yeah, I forgot that word the Anabaptists used. There's a German word. There's a better word for it. But I think that the better word would just be non-resistance. While verbally we're not pacifistic, physically we are sort of pacifistic, but not in the context of the postmodern definition of pacifism. And let me find another quote here. So this one's from Athenagoras. "These we hold in contempt, though to the generally they appear matters of great importance. For we have learned not only not to return blow for blow, nor to go to law with those who plunder and rob us, but to those who smite us on one side of the face, to offer the other side also, and to those who take away our coat, to give likewise our cloak. But when we have surrendered our property, they plot against our very bodies and souls, pouring upon us wholesale charges of crimes of which we are guiltless even in thought, but which belong to these idle praters themselves and the whole tribe of those who are like them." And Justin Martyr also said, "But they who are brought up licentiously in wicked customs and are prejudiced in their own opinions should kill and hate us, whom we not only do not hate, but as proved pity and endeavor to lead to repentance." So the Anabaptists, when we look at the first writers of Christianity, we take their words literally. So how would they be the same with Lex Talionis? We would also teach what the Ante-Nicene Church Fathers. We would teach the same interpretations of the Sermon on the Mount and Lex Talionis. And that's why we emphasized this Sermon on the Mount, just as did the church for the first 300 years when it was still illegal to practice the faith in public. So basically, Lex Talionis, I'm convinced, the perfect consequence of turning the other cheek and denying self-defense would result in martyrs, and that was the historic view of the early church. The Christians were being hunted down by lions. The Christians didn't defend themselves against the lions or the Roman authorities who put them in prison. That sums up how I view Lex Talionis.
Okay, Andrew, now since the question was asked to all of us, here's your turn to answer.
Sure, and I'll attempt to. Sadly, Master had to leave, but I'll attempt to answer it. That I think it's quite obvious that we are always to pray not only for justice but for mercy as well, especially for those that we think have been wronged. And that seems to be a key part of our spiritual orientation, and should inform our decisions when we have these sorts of decisions about punishment, justice, and violence. But I'll also note that at least my understanding in my tradition is that we pray for mercy, but the obligation is to enact justice. When it comes to being a magistrate or a police officer or a parent or what have you. And the point I'll make to Henry, and we can debate whether this is an appropriate example, but Andrew Stratelates himself is a 2nd century saint who was a soldier. He was well known for his campaigns to and has some miracles actually associated with him and a handful of other soldiers going into battle with no armor and miraculously turning the tide against the enemy and not being harmed. He clearly believed in self-defense. He clearly engaged in military action, lawful military action, on the orders of the Roman magistrate. But he was also martyred. First, they attempted to kill him and his Christian officers, but that apparently would cause his entire the soldiers under him to rebel and cause a riot and so on. And so they instead let him go, and he went and was ambushed by another Roman legion who had sufficient anti-Christian sentiment to obey the orders to kill them, and they were killed in battle. And the implication is that they went down swinging, so to speak. So it's true that some martyrs were radical pacifists and they tended to be civilians, but that's not the only tradition we have, even from the first 3 centuries of Christianity. And that I believe that any reading of the Lex Talionis or any other part that is in conflict with that, we need to look at it more carefully to see what's going on, and that's sort of I think the key contention we have, and yeah, that's all that I have at this moment.
Okay, so again, maybe not necessarily get going off too many rabbit trails, but I think one thing that's important to hash out at some point is, what does justice look like in the New Covenant for the Christian to do? That's at least one of the points of disagreement here. Now, as to the other example of the Andrew Stratelates, yeah, I mean, I'm familiar with the warrior, the soldier martyrs. So, for example, in Ronald Sider's War and Killing, where he describes all the accounts of the written extant records of the church fathers themselves, and then the written extant martyrologies, where there are soldiers that are in the army. Now, this then is sort of begging the question, and because if you're in the Roman army when you're converted to Christianity, you can't leave. I mean, that's essentially a death sentence. We do have in the apostolic tradition by Hippolytus a direct statement that if you are in the army or in the magisterium, the Roman political magisterium, that if you are to take anyone's life, you are to be excommunicated from the church. Now, and if you encourage someone to join the army, you're to be excommunicated from the church. So, in all likelihood, Andrew Stratelates was probably converted whilst in uniform. The other problem is we have to be careful when we look at the actions of a layperson vis-a-vis the official teachings of what's respected as the authority figures within the church. So, for example, it would be a mistake to assume if some, say 1,000 years from now, after some nuclear apocalypse or some sort of grid down scenario, people are trying to piece together what the 21st century Catholic Church looked like. And what happened to survive was evidence of Catholics using contraception and only a handful of encyclicals condemning it. It would be a grave mistake for that future archaeologist to interpret Catholic teaching of the 21st century as basically being okay with the use of contraception. And then, so as to not accuse me of begging the question, what did the early church fathers teach on the issue? Now, I'm not going to read through all of the things that they've stated on this particular passage, but it does behoove us to at least have a list of the sort of consensus. And so I will again be using James F. Davis's Lex Talionis and Early Judaism and the Exhortation of Jesus in Matthew 5:38 to 42. And he finds passages from, let's see, 2 Clement 13:4, Polycarp, his letter Philippians 12:3, the Martyrdom of Polycarp 7:1-2, Justin the Martyr dialogue with Trypho 96, Justin's First Apology 15, Justin's First Apology 16. Let's see, Irenaeus against Heresies 3:18-6. This one is very close to the one that you read about Athenagoras, Henry. This is Irenaeus 4:13-3, and this one does bear repeating. For to him that take away thy coat, he says, give to him thy cloak also, and from him that taketh away the goods, ask them not again. And as ye would that men should do unto you, do ye unto them, so that we may not grieve as those who are unwilling to be defrauded, but rejoice as to those who have been given willingly, and as rather conferring upon our own neighbors than yielding to necessity. And if anyone, he says, shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain, so that thou mayest not follow him as a slave, but as a free man to go before him. Show thyself in all things kindly disposed and useful to thy neighbor, not regarding their evil intentions, but performing thy kind offices, assimilating thyself to the Father. So again, we see along with Athenagoras this idea that no, you don't ask what's taken from you back. We also see against Heresies 4:33-4, Clement of Alexandria, the Educator 3:12, Clement of Alexandria, the Miscellanies 3:7, Clement of Alexandria, who is the salvation of the rich man 18, Tertullian against the Jews 3, Tertullian against Marcion 2:18, Tertullian against Marcion 4:16, Tertullian exhortation on charity 6, Tertullian flight in persecution 13, Origen first principles 3:6, Origen against Celsus 7.25, Origen against Celsus 7.61. Now, this is far from an exhaustive list of church fathers who look at the last three antitheses and take them to their logical, strictest possible conclusion. But we see that the vast preponderance of evidence so back it up. When one wants to determine the meaning of a text, let's say, for example, the New Testament text, we first need to understand, since it's written in Greek, what the normal usage of terms are in Koine Greek. And I think in this case, the words that are being used are not necessarily being used in a new way, in the same way that agape might be infused with new meaning. So then we look at the usage of those terms within the context of the New Testament passage, which we have all been wrestling with tonight. Thirdly, in whether you're trying to say that the Greek word is being used in a unique sense or new sense, like agape, or even if it's being used in the generic sense, you then need to ask, well, how was it read and interpreted by those that came later? So if you were to postulate, say, that N.T. Wright does, that anastasis, which means bodily resurrection in Revelation 20, in which case he says in all Jewish and pagan writings it always meant a physical life after death, he then posits it had a brand new meaning. He uncharacteristically fails to follow through with following what the church fathers would have interpreted Revelation 20 as in the immediate context, first, second, third centuries, which he, by the way, did do in his work on the resurrection. He looked at the rabbinical, pagan, Christian, and then post-apostolic writings. So if we look at the post-apostolic writings, there is no indication that the actual authors of scriptural, of teaching, of apologies to pagan emperors or pagan philosophers, instruction to individuals, or disputes with heretics by the lawful religious authorities within Christianity interpreted it in any other way. And I would argue, and I think most Christians would argue, especially of the more high church tradition, that the explicit teachings of those in the authority of the church are to be deferred to over and against any sort of apparent or actual deviation in the work of the laity in adhering to those rules. As, for example, today, the fact that many Catholics ignore the teachings on contraception does not in any way invalidate that intuition that what really determines the teaching of the church is not what the lay people do when they break the teachings of the Pope, but what they actually do, what he actually says they should do. And in that vein, we do not see any evidence in any way, whether it's pastoral, whether it's written to hostile philosophers, whether it's written to pagans or emperors, that any other way was intended by these authors. And so at the best, we might say that these accounts, if we don't want to take the charge that they were embellished in any way, which some, I think, during the Reformation did take due to the hagiographic nature of them, would be in the case of a layperson not acting in accordance with the teachings of the legitimate spiritual authorities of the day. So that's how I'd sort of deal with that. And again, it was not an exhaustive list, and this is not really the time or the place to get into one, but more just to give you a flavor of what's at stake here. So we don't have a whole lot of time left. So what I think I'll do is I'll give Andrew the last word. So I'll let Henry go next, and then we'll give Andrew the last word, and then we'll wrap it up. So does that sound good to you guys?
Yeah.
Okay. So Henry, go ahead and say your stuff.
Yeah, so I think it's important that we need to understand the interpretation of Lex Talionis in Ante-Nicene writings versus post-Nicene writings. And that's the main focus in scholar David Berceau in his books on the early church fathers. So just to quote a few examples in the Ante-Nicene writings, we have Justin Martyr's first apology. At the end, we have an epistle of Marcus Aurelius to Justin Martyr, and we have a really interesting story of those of the faith, Christians, who still have not left the Roman army yet. It's a very good story that summarizes what Christians, how they interpret Lex Talionis, even when they were still in catechumens, if you will, in the Roman army. In the story, during each war in the army, everyone goes to the battlefield, except for the Christians. Justin Martyr, he writes that, well, actually, it's Marcus Aurelius, excuse me. He writes that the Christians, they would not pick up any physical sword. Rather, they would get on their hands and knees, and they would pray for rain and deliverance from the enemies. So that's an example in the Ante-Nicene Fathers, how Christians in the army they interpreted involvement in the army, and notice that they never defend themselves through a physical sword, but they write that they have spiritual swords, and that's an idiom for prayer. Prayers the Christian version of self-defense, or our true defense is the spiritual sword through prayer. And then we see you mentioned Irenaeus against heresies. It's important to also know that even in the 12th canon of Nicaea, uh, the Roman Church, even the 4th century, if you read the canons of Nicaea, the Roman Church still wrote that they requested the catechumens to leave the Roman army prior to receiving the sacraments. So you could not essentially join the church and partake of the sacraments, if you will, until you have given up your involvement in the Roman army. That was the attitude before Augustine formulated just war theory. So that's my take on how the fathers interpreted Lex Talionis.
Okay, Andrew, we'll give you the last word and we'll wrap it up.
Okay, I'll try to talk fast. The first thing.
Well, you don't have to be too fast. I mean, say what you need to say. I don't mean to be pressuring.
Oh, sure. So the first thing I'll note is in the hagiography of soldiers like Andrew Stratelates, we notice no condemnation of their military service or even combat that leads to human death in the same way that we would in the hagiography of like Saint Mary of Egypt, who had a fornication problem. And so one of the key things that's different is that those hagiographies don't actually have a condemnation or repentance of their military service in the same way that we would see it in others. And this is including the early hagiographies of warrior saints. The other thing, and I agree, I love that Marcus Aurelius letter, even though there's some contention on how true it is. But the thing that I'll note is when he's talking about what the Christians are doing, the issue he takes isn't that they don't take out weapons, but that they're not engaging in the pagan practices of calling down the gods, praying over the weapons, and trumpeting. Instead, they pray to God, and then God basically causes a hailstorm to go on the enemies, and that allows them to win the battle. So, there is definitely a constraint on Christians engaging in warfare and especially killing compared to even Jews or non-Christians. And there's a contention between the East and the West, where the East actually had a policy up until relatively recently, and still in some jurisdictions, where if you were in combat and killed a person or a human, be it police combat or military combat, you had to take a period of between 1 and 3 years of penance before you were able to take the sacrament of the Eucharist, which doesn't exist in the West. And part of that, and you can read it two ways. One is that the West loosened things. The other is the West had to think hard about them. Is in the West, as the Roman Empire was actually falling, the people who were charged with the defense of cities by the magistrate were the bishops, and they were told, organize the military defense of the town lawfully. And the Westerners, being very pragmatic, sort of came up with just war to figure out under what conditions is this appropriate and when is it. And so I guess that's sort of my concluding thought, is that a lot of what you're saying is exactly correct, but I think that we have to narrow our understanding a little bit. And I totally agree with the Anabaptists that the amount of vengeance allowed by the modern Western culture is not in accord with the Christian gospel. But again, I take a less radical stance than absolute physical passivity or passivity to violence.
All right. I just want to thank Andrew and Henry, and of course Master Sanders, who unfortunately had to leave early tonight, for participating in tonight's discussion. Hopefully we can cover more, if not all, of the antitheses. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.